This is Norway maple, Acer platanoides, or if you're a Greek scholar, you might say platanoides, but we don't. We say platanoides, which means the platanus-like maple, Acer platanoides. And Acer platanoides is a very, very common landscape tree in the Vancouver area. It's in fact, it's even a little bit on the invasive side. Occasionally, you'll have a tree like this, and you'll find seedlings sort of nearby. And in eastern North America, this is a bit of a problem tree, in fact, because it's so well adapted to eastern North America, despite the fact that it comes from Western Europe, that it finds itself in native woodlands there, and it shades out the native flora. And so you'll, if you look up Acer platanoides, you'll get a lot of chatter about how horrible a tree it is and how we shouldn't really grow it. But we don't really have those problems as significantly in Vancouver. It's a maple, and so you're going to see an opposite arrangement. The leaves and the buds are oppositely arranged. Very, very handsome buds. They're kind of bullet-shaped buds. You see that over the winter. We're starting to see a little bit of autumn color here, and the autumn color really depends a lot. Pardon me. It depends a lot on the season, but also on the seedling. Certain cultivars, like this one, which is Emerald Queen, typically produce yellow fall color, whereas other cultivars, such as famous one, Schwedleri, produces really good, rich burgundy and red fall color. The leaves, like most maples, is palmately lobed. The lobes have hair tip points on them. So if you look very closely at the leaves, you can see that the teeth are drawn out into actual hair tips. Normally 5-lobed, but occasionally 7-lobed, and occasionally 3-lobed. The flowers, which obviously you can't see now, are sort of corymbose clusters of yellow flowers, very pretty flowers, and they're born before the leaves. And the fruit, we have lots of clusters of fruit. We'll get a close-up of the fruits. The way to recognize Norway maple is that the samaras are almost horizontal, that is 180 degrees, so they look quite different. Not surprisingly, considering this can be invasive in certain places, this is a pretty adaptable tree. It doesn't really need a lot of water once it's established. In Vancouver, we don't really have the conditions that would allow it to be invasive. It prefers a little bit drier winter conditions, and what we have is a lot of the seed that falls to the ground is just going to rot because it's too wet. There's too much organic matter on the ground. The bark, as you can see, on a young tree, the bark is fairly unadorned, but gradually develops this beautiful vertical fissuring, and that's typically the way we recognize it in the landscape in the winter. It is sometimes confused with the sugar maple, but the sugar maple tends to have a narrower 5-lobed leaf and doesn't have hair tip points. And if you're really getting technical, what you can do is snap off a petiole, and if the sap is running, and it's not running now, so you're not going to see this, but if the sap is running, then you'll see a white latex in Acer platanoides, and you wouldn't see that in Acer saccharum, because Acer saccharum, of course, is the source of maple syrup, and you wouldn't want milky syrup, would you? Okay, we're looking at Arbutus unido. Arbutus unido is, of course, related to Arbutus menziesii. But whereas Arbutus menziesii is native to the west coast of North America, Arbutus unido is native to to Western Europe and Western and Southern Europe, in Southern Ireland and in the Iberian Peninsula, that's Spain and Portugal, and then off into Western Asia as well, so Turkey and in that area as well. And it's a tree after about 50 years, but we call it a shrub because it's mostly shrubby. If you like, you could call it an arborescent shrub because it does have a sort of tree-like quality even when it's small. It's an evergreen. The leaves are alternately arranged as they are in nearly all plants in the Ericaceae. It has flowers that are, again, very much like those that you would see in Arbutus menziesii, except that they're produced at this time of the year, that is, in the autumn. And you can see that they're produced in the autumn, and it takes about a year for the fruit to ripen. And so I'm looking at some unripe fruit here and a little bit of ripe fruit here. And the fruits themselves are a little bit bigger than the fruits of Arbutus menziesii, but they're similarly tuberculate. That is, they have little bumps all over them. This is a really terrific plant. It is, the discussions of Arbutus menziesii being, a little bit difficult, more than a little bit difficult in the landscape. This is actually a very easy plant in the landscape. And like so many of the plants, broadleaf evergreen plants that we've been seeing, it's very easily manipulated, pruned, sheared. Of course, when shearing a plant like this, all you're going to get is foliage. You're not going to get the flowers and the fruit. And this is in a fairly protected spot, and that's why we're seeing such a good load of fruit and flowers. But this plant is not unusual in its flowering and fruiting. So this is a plant that can grow to maybe 8 meters tall and a little bit wider than that. It is drought tolerant. It is sun tolerant. You can grow it in the shade. You're not going to get nearly as much flower or fruit. But the fruit is edible. Now, there's a caveat there. Pliny the Elder is the one who named the plant. He called it unido. Unido means I eat one, and that gives you an indication of how much he thought the fruit was worth eating if you'd only eat one. This is Betula nigra Cully. Cully's the cultivar name. It has a trade name, patented, or a trademark name that is Heritage. And so it's known as the Heritage birch. It's pretty spectacular birch. And it's really valuable for a couple of reasons. I'll get to those in a minute. It's pretty typical birch in that it has peeling papery bark. Not all birches do, but many do. It has leaves that are more or less ovate with impressed pinnate veins above and quite bluish on the underside. These are a little bit pubescent on the backside of the leaf, and when the new shoots are formed, they're pubescent as well. Very, very stringy branches is quite typical of birches to produce lots of kind of wiry branches that then droop. I was going to say that the great thing about this tree, the bark exfoliate in this way. And if you look at the some of the bark, as it sort of turns over and exposes its underside, the reason that it's known as Betula nigra, or the black birch or the water birch, is that the backside of these curls are often very, very dark. And now on Heritage, this was a selection that was made because the bark is very, very light in color. It's not typical of what you would see in the wild. But this sort of roughness of the bark, where the curls and the rolls don't actually come off, they just kind of sit there and they wear away. This is really typical of water birch, or river birch, I guess is the proper common name. Birches, members of the Betulaceae, and they produce their flowers in catkins. The male catkins are exposed over the winter, and in the early spring they elongate and they expel their pollen from the anthers, and the female flowers are born at the base of those catkins, and so they're not really visible now. They really are only visible in the spring when the pollen starts to release. And then they're going to, the female flowers are going to expand into a little kind of, looks a lot like a catkin, but it's a little fatter. And all of the seeds, which are papery, they're little papery seeds, and they're born in these seed catkins, which then shatter in the summer to disperse the seed. And the seed is winged, little tiny seeds, and they fly all over the place. So the other really important thing about this in the landscape, besides the fact that it's a birch and so it'll tolerate some moisture in the soil, the really important thing is that there's an insect called the bronze birch borer, and the bronze birch borer attacks birches, and it attacks, as far as we know, every birch on the planet except for this species. And so what that means, and this is very sad, what that means is that we can't really grow reliably any other birch species other than Betula nigra. And so this birch is very valuable. If you want a birch in the landscape, then this is basically it. People do grow other birches, but they are susceptible to the bronze birch borer. And what that insect does is she lays her eggs in the tops of the trees, and the larvae bore inside and kill off the branches, and they gradually kill the tree from the top down. And so you won't see that in a heritage birch. This is Clematis armandii, or clematis if you prefer, named for Armand David, who was a French plant collector in China. This is a Chinese evergreen clematis, and like most clematis, it climbs by way of wrapping petioles and petioles, and this is a very, very distinctive plant because of its 3 long lanceolate leaflets, very, very shiny green leaves with purplish, wiry purplish stems. And as you can see, very, very graceful, very elegant looking foliage. It is here growing on a metal frame, and this is again a problem with clematis not being able to grab onto anything sort of bigger than your little finger. And so I'll show you a close-up of how this affects the plant. The other thing about clematis, and this is something I didn't mention when we talked about Clematis montana, is that when this is grown on a static surface, that is, like there's not very much wind where we're standing right here, and there's very little movement, and what happens with evergreens is that evergreens eventually, the leaves will eventually die. The problem with clematis is they don't like to let go of their leaves very easily, and so what happens is we get old dead leaves accumulating, and if you have nice fresh leaves on top, you can't really see that, but in areas where all of the branches die, then it can look pretty horrible. So if a plant like this is growing in a tree, there's enough movement in the tree typically to kind of work those dead leaves off. Now I shouldn't sort of dwell on the negative, because this really is a beautiful plant. For example, flowering in the spring, these are precocious flowers. They should be flowering in February, in March, rather than in October, but here they are. They're fragrant, they're white, they're very, very showy, and there'll be thousands of flowers on a plant like this. In my opinion, this is a plant that requires a fairly massive frame on which to climb, but it needs strings or something small so that it can actually get up onto the frame. Of course, one of the most beautiful sights I've seen is this romping along the ground as a ground cover and then climbing into trees, which is what it does naturally in the wild, and then draping from the tree branches. This is a plant this is a clematis like any other clematis. It requires a cool root run and its head in the sun. This is a fairly broad leaf, and so it doesn't need full sun. Half a day of sun is probably good for this, but it's also moderately tender, and it does need to have some protection from cold wind and cold weather in general. This is Ilex crenata convexa. The cultivar name is convexa. Ilex crenata is known as the Japanese holly, and it's a very, very variable species, Japanese holly. The cultivar convexa is sort of one form, a typical leaf size, but in this shrubby species, the leaves are curled around. So the edges of the leaves are recurved, and so the top of the leaf appears convex. Now this is a shrub that is a spreading plant. The branches sort of spread out at about 30 degrees from the horizontal, and it will continue to do that and create a nice big wide shrub that's maybe taller than it is wide, perhaps to 3 meters tall and 4 or 5 meters across. But in general, what people see in the landscape is pruned, that is sheared back plants. And so if that's done regularly, then you're just going to see a box or a meatball or whatever shape is made by the landscapers. But if it's left for only even just a couple of years, then you start to see that characteristic branching come back. So ilex, the hollies, are alternate leaved plants. The buds are very, very tiny. You're not even going to see the buds, even when they're about to burst. You're not even going to see the buds. They're so small. The flowers are similarly tiny. You won't even see the flowers on a shrub like this. And the fruits are mostly hidden. You can see if you turn over the plant, the berries are on the backs of the branches. Ilex crenata, in general, a very, very tough plant. Ilex species in general are very tough plants. They grow in droughty soils. They put their roots down very, very deep. If anybody's ever tried to get rid of English holly, you'll know what I'm talking about. The roots just go so deep, and they'll break off, and the plant will regrow from the broken off roots. So very, very difficult to dislodge, and that's great when you have a plant like Ilex crenata, because it's not invasive, but will tolerate all kinds of urban conditions. So it grows in the sun or in the shade. You can see there's a little bit of yellowing of the leaves, and that's natural. That's a natural consequence of the sun on the leaves. And so in general, when you plant this in the sun, it always looks like there's a little bit of sunshine on the plant, so it's a little bit sun-kissed. Don't eat the fruits, leave them for the birds. I don't believe they're poisonous, but I don't believe that they're palatable either. This is the privet honeysuckle. The scientific name is Lonicera ligastrina, variety pileata. You'll often see it listed in books or catalogs as Lonicera pileata. The name privet honeysuckle is apt, I think, because it's often grown for sort of barrier plantings like privet is. It's typically much lower than privet. Privet normally grows tall. Privet is ligustrum. In any case, this is a shrub that people think it's a ground cover, and it has that sort of ground covering, sort of almost horizontal or arching branches low to the ground, but it builds itself up, and within a few years it can very easily get to a meter or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And so this is a shrub that requires, in the landscape at least, it requires regular pruning, and it responds very, very well to regular pruning. It is a Lonicera. The honeysuckle family is noted for oppositely arranged leaves and buds, and this is definitely opposite. The leaves themselves have an entire margin, slightly recurved margin, which makes it look even smoother, and the shape of the leaf is more or less ovate or narrowly ovate, or sometimes ovate lanceolate. Very, very pretty plant when it's grown in the shade or when it's grown in rich, moist soil. If it's in soil that's somehow poor in one respect, that is either in fertility or in moisture, then it tends to yellow, and you can see a little bit of this yellowing on the shrub. And then but the advantage to that, if it's a little bit drier or maybe a little bit poorer, is that it tends to produce lots of flowers, and if it does, then the flowers turn into beautiful amethyst purple berries. They're very, very tiny, and they look delicious, but they're bitter and should be left to the birds. And it's nice to see the littlest birds hopping around and going after these berries. As I say, a very, very versatile shrub. It's used sun or shade. As long as it's got enough moisture, it looks great in the sun, and you can prune crap out of it like people do in normal maintenance. A very, very useful shrub in the landscape. This is Parthenocissus tricuspidata. Tricuspidata means, of course, 3 teeth. And the common name for Parthenocissus tricuspidata is Boston ivy. And it's named Boston ivy because it's very, very popular in New England, in eastern North America, eastern United States. But it is actually native to Japan. And it was collected in Japan I believe it was in the 1700s, the late 1700s, and became very, very popular in New England because of the predominance of stone buildings, stone and other kinds of masonry buildings. And as you can see, very, very happily climbing on any kind of flat surface. Just like Parthenocissus quinquifolia, only even more effective at sticking. And so this is a climber that will easily go more than 30 or 40 meters up a building, up the side of a building. And it'll actually cover all of the windows and everything. You can see from this piece that I've got here, this is a fairly mature branch. It's very, very long petioles because this is the leaves are basically placing themselves so that they don't shade each other. And this is covered in fruit. Very, very good fruit year this year. But the reason that people grow Boston ivy is not for its fruit, although the birds might argue with you. It is for the spectacular autumn color. And it ranges anything from this sort of coral yellow pink to brilliant burgundy red and purple. Flowers just exactly like they are in Virginia creeper, very, very tiny, almost insignificant. And as you see here, the berries look like little tiny grapes, which is no surprise as these are members of the Vitaceae. So the leaf arrangement is exactly as it is in all other Vitaceae, and in Boston ivy, like Virginia creeper, the leaves are opposite to the tendrils, and on a mature branch like this, it's not so easy to see. In fact, these leaves and fruits are growing on a short shoot, not on a long shoot. But when we look at the wall behind me and see the more juvenile growth, you can see exactly what I'm talking about with the tendrils being opposite the leaves. The leaves are very, very small here. This is one of the interesting things about Boston ivy. It starts out with very small leaves, and once it's mature, the leaves change a lot. They become almost entire on the margins. You can still see the teeth, but not nearly as lobed and toothed along the margin as with the smaller leaves. And the self-sticking pads on the ends of the tendrils are very obvious when you see it on the wall this way. All right, this is rhododendron Peter John Mezet. It's known in the trade as PJM. And so in fact, that's what we call it as a common name, PJM rhododendron. And this is a rhododendron like other rhododendrons that you've seen, except that it's in a different group of rhododendrons than what we've seen so far. It's not like Hansel with hairs on the back of the leaf. This is in a group of rhododendrons that has what are known as scales on the back of the leaf, and you'd need a magnification to actually be able to see that. But you can usually tell this group by the aroma. And so you can't, obviously, looking at this, but I can, just by handling the foliage. It has a fairly strong aroma. And people describe this aroma in a variety of ways for this particular plant. I've had students who told me that it smelled like hot dogs, like raw wieners, or luncheon meat. This is not the way that it's described typically online, but it is a difficult smell to characterize. In any case, typically, like a rhododendron, we have clustered leaves with an alternate arrangement and a radial phyllotaxy. and that shouldn't be surprising for a rhododendron. And so you have these fairly, sort of empty stems with clusters of leaves on top. You have terminal flower buds, and from these we'll have a kind of rounded cluster of beautiful purple flowers. But the interesting thing about PJM is that in the wintertime, the leaves turn a kind of plum purple, or sort of bronzy purple. So green in the shade like they are now, and then turning a kind of plum purple. And you'll also notice that on some of the branches, that last year's or 2-year-old leaves are starting to turn, and those will turn red and fall. This is an evergreen shrub. The leaves are more or less elliptic or elliptic ovate. You have a wide variety of leaf sizes depending on how much moisture the plant is getting or how much shade the plant is in. In the sun, PJM grows to probably 2 meters or so, and you can see this is a shaded spot, and it's actually ideal for this plant. And it's growing probably 3 to 4 meters tall, so it's probably double the size that you would see with a plant in the sun. You're not going to get much in the way of fruits on this. I do see kind of an aborted seed capsule here, but not much. The reason that people grow this in the landscape, it's a fairly tough plant as long as it has well-drained soil and some summer moisture. It's not tolerant of the unirrigated landscape, but it is fairly tough otherwise. This is Salix purpurea. It's known as the purple osier or purple osier willow. It is it's kind of typical osier in that its stems are very flexible, and it's very easy to weave the stems. Once they're harvested, they retain their suppleness for some time before drying. This is a typical willow in some respects, alternately arranged leaves. You'll find on some plants that the leaves can be sub-opposite or even opposite, or in fact even whorled. So you have basically the whole gamut of leaf arrangements, but typically, and this is also very typical with willows, it's an alternate leaf arrangement. Now this is a shrub. It's a fairly sizable shrub. It is native to northern Asia. It grows in the way that you see here. It grows from multiple stems from low on a stalk. So it's not a suckering shrub, but it appears like it might be a suckering shrub. If I was to lift all of this up so that you could see the base, you would see merely a kind of single stem with hundreds and hundreds of branches arising from the base. It's a willow, so it is dioecious, and the male flowers and the female flowers are very small on this species, and so they're almost not even sort of recognized. The great thing about this shrub is that it tolerates all kinds of pruning. It's so, like Ilex crenata, you can prune it back right to the ground, and then it'll spring back and looks nice and lush. It's a deciduous shrub, and when these leaves fall off, particularly in the winter time, the stems will go purple, and so that's why it has the name purple osier. The leaves, as you can see, are kind of blue-green underneath and dark green above. It's a very sort of elegant looking shrub, but it does need to be pruned on a regular basis to keep it looking kind of tidy. So in terms of where we grow it, willows are famous for being able to tolerate wet ground, and indeed you can grow this in very wet ground, but you can also grow it in sort of typical garden situation. It even tolerates a little bit of drought, although the plant is not going to look as lush and nice, but it will tolerate that drought, particularly if it's in a somewhat more shaded position. But again, like all willows, this is a plant for the full open exposure. So ideal conditions: full sun, moist soil, lots of air circulation. There's a problem that we have with the purple osier, and that's a gall. It's an insect. It's probably an aphid that attacks the stems and forms galls. This is Zelkova serrata, sometimes known as the Japanese Zelkova, but in Japanese and increasingly it's also known as the kiyaki. And this is a fairly easy tree to recognize. It looks a little bit like a flowering cherry in the way that it comes from the nursery with a straight stem and a spreading compact crown, but it's a member of the elm family. Zelkovas are elm relatives, and they have what I would call probably the most regular leaves, nice sort of ovate lanceolate leaves with very, very regular serrations, very regular marginal serrations, and very obvious alternate bud arrangement. And so we'll see a picture of that in a second. This is a very popular tree because it tolerates urban conditions and it doesn't get too big too quickly. It is actually a fairly large tree. Given enough space, it's going to grow easily to 25 meters and probably almost that spread as well. The flowers are born in the spring on leafless branches, and they're very, very tiny, insignificant, I would call them, and they're followed by a kind of a small black drupe, a little berry. And again, we almost never see the fruits because in general, people plant a single clone, a single cultivar in a group. And so without a pollen that's different, it doesn't typically produce fruit. As I said, this is a fairly common tree for the urban landscape nowadays, and it's pretty tough. One of the problems that we have with it, though, is that it tends, and you can see this, I think, in looking at the structure. It's structurally not very strong because the branching is very tight. And what happens when the branching is tight, it's okay when the branches are small, but when they get very, very large, they kind of push each other apart. And this is, you can see this split here, this is a zone of weakness. And this is where you'll get branch failure. And so we need to select Zelkovas for better branching. Fall color, again, fall color is variable. It can often be spectacular on seedlings in the wild, but the cultivars, for some reason, they've selected these compact ones and they almost all have sort of poor fall color, maybe kind of an orangish yellow or brownish orange, but nothing really to write home about. In the wild, the autumn colors are flame colors. They're really pretty spectacular.